let's talk about the individual. How does the individual first find God, and then we'll turn to the society, because you also talk about this in your article.
Yeah. So on an individual level, I think there's so many kind of so-called spiritual practices, secular spirituality, all of these kind of things. And I'm surprised that very few people try and find God, but I think part of the reason maybe is they don't know how. And in the article that we've been talking about,
can we get that up? Can we go scroll to the bottom of the article?
I kind of suggest, and the same way is not going to be true for everybody. God can reveal himself in whichever way, he wants to. But it's just a suggestion on how, based on kind of religious Islamic philosophy, how one can find God.
Yeah. So you give is it a 3-step method? Yeah.
So the first step is ultimately just remembering God at least once or twice in a day. I suggest in the morning or in the evening. And the first thing, be physically clean, and that's an Islamic practice, but it's also a religious practice in general to be physically clean before engaging in kind of spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Make a private place to sit and just spend a few minutes in focus and concentration. And the founder of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he said that when you pray, you should imagine that that you can see God, and if you can't do that, then at least imagine that God can see you. And that's a hadith. That's a hadith. Sorry, I thought it might. Yeah.
It's the definition of a muhsin, one who does good.
And some people know, what to say. Some people can think about prayers that they can say, but often we need some kind of prescribed prayer as well. And I suggest one. And this is actually the first chapter of the Holy Quran. That I've suggested in this article. And the reason is the first chapter of the Holy Quran is called Surah Al-Fatiha. And this is a kind of equivalent to Lord's Prayer in Christianity, but it's far superior in its scope. But it's not dogmatic. It doesn't appeal to one specific religion or, try and create divisions between religions or say you have to follow this prophet or this person. It's a general kind of prayer to God, and it has that universality to it. So the prayer starts, in the name of God, the gracious, the merciful. All praise belongs to God, Lord of all the worlds, the gracious, the merciful, master of the day of judgment. Thee alone do we worship, and thee alone do we implore for help. Guide us on the right path, the path of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy blessings, those who have not incurred thy displeasure, and those who have not gone astray. So if you think about those words, there's barely a person in the world who would disagree with that sentiment. And so that's a prayer that's very important in Islam, but it's a universal prayer as well. So I suggested that, in Islam, we kind of say it in Arabic in our daily prayers, but it can be said in English, kind of as a way of starting and building a connection with God.
Well, it's called, the Fatiha means the opening. So in a way, it's the opening of your relationship with God as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's the opening chapter of the Quran itself. And then, so after that, you can pray to God, pray for the things you want. I once had a friend, sorry, this is a sidetrack.
I think this counts as a story that we're going into as a side issue. So
no, that's good.
Are you sure you want to?
Yeah, I apologize. But so I had a friend from uni who said that he didn't believe in God, and I said, well,
you just said we can't be friends anymore. Is that what you said?
And I said, well, why don't you pray to God? And he said, well, I pray every night to God, but nothing happens. And I say, well, what do you pray for? And he says, well, I pray that I'm healthy, and I pray my family are healthy. And I say, well, are you healthy? Is your family healthy? And he said, yes. So I said, well, so that's a good thing to pray. But also, you can also pray if you want to for things that are more specific or things that that you want.
And even for God to reveal himself to you.
For God to reveal himself, yeah.
Yeah. And that'll happen in a very different way for different friends. I've had friends who've done that and they were like, wow, this incredibly unlikely thing happened, which is so specific to their life.
Yeah.
And, if that happened to someone else, it wouldn't even make sense. But for them, it was like the thing. So I think, God will have his own way of finding everybody or revealing himself to everybody. Yeah. So what did you say then to talk about? What did you talk about next?
So the next part of it, if you scroll down.
In the broad strokes, yeah.
Yeah, if you just scroll down. So the next one is charity, good moral action. So there are two parts to faith. One is to kind of worship God, but one is also to serve God's creation. And so good moral action is really important, and it's a way of bringing you closer to God. And so this can be kind of anything that maybe one feels that they're deficient in or lacking in their moral actions, or giving extra to charity or something like that.
And you've said ideally a small amount each day. Is that regularity what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, exactly. And often we talked about the discipline and the kind of regularity in religion. That's an important factor.
Yeah.
So doing things, small but often is sometimes better than being super intense, and then forgetting about it afterwards.
Yeah.
So that kind of builds a habit maybe.
Okay.
And the last thing is to remember God regularly. So even, aside from those times where you're specifically sitting by yourself and kind of like praying and contemplating, even when you're going about your day-to-day activities, you can, think about God. And one prayer in Islam, but it's also in the Bible, in the name of God, the gracious, the merciful. And in Islam, we kind of say that before we start eating, or, before kind of doing anything of any importance, even things that aren't that important. But it's a way of God kind of blessing that thing that we're doing.
Yeah.
And again, it's a way of bringing you nearer to God.
Yeah.
And the way that God can reveal himself, as we just talked about, it can be diverse and unique to the individual.
Yeah.
And that uniqueness is really the thing that convinces you more. So people say, well, why doesn't God just kind of like come down and then show himself to everybody? Well, that might not convince people. People might think it's a magic trick, or people might think that, there's some other explanation for it.
Richard Dawkins famously said that.
Yes, he said that even if God's name was painted in the stars, he said, I still wouldn't believe in God, because it was probably just some kind of trick or something like that.
Or hallucination, he said, of my mind.
Oh, hallucination, yeah. But God knows how he can convince people that he exists, and he can build that kind of complete certainty. And that's what Islam teaches, that you can actually go from kind of just having a theory that God might exist to that point of certainty.
Okay.
And that's what, these steps can kind of help with. And that's what, Islam talks about.
Okay. So that's kind of the individual. Now the question's asking, how do we create such a society that is kind of God-fearing? What would you say to that?
Well, I think he somewhat answered it insofar as it begins with an individual. How do you do it across society? I think society is naturally going to come back towards a belief in God, because they're slowly tasting the consequences of not believing in God in almost every facet of society. They've, from the perspective of the individual subunit of a family and the breakdown of the family and the consequences that has upon children and upon the next generation, they're going to see that, and they have already seen that to a large extent, especially in deprived areas in the United States, but increasingly here in the UK as well. In foreign policy and the kind of mad rush for global domination we saw in World War I, we saw in World War II, we're probably going to see in World War III in a few years. Stated very matter-of-factly, isn't it? So I think in almost all aspects of our life, and especially in the economic sphere as well, where we have this continuous, we're now going into a position with, especially in the Western society, where we have an odd two things happening. We're having a recession along with inflation, which usually doesn't happen at the same time. Because of a variety of reasons, but the interest, we don't need to go into that, but the point is that entire system is also failing people at an industrial scale.
The interest-based
economic system. So I think and interest is explicitly forbidden by every Abrahamic faith, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and almost certainly probably other religions as well.
Yeah.
So I think at every aspect of society, people are realizing slowly, and they're coming towards a belief in God. They're not going to come to Christianity, right? Because frankly, Christianity is, a dying religion. I think Christians know it as well. It has no power or sway over the minds of men anymore. And the reason is because Christianity first of all, Christianity had very few doctrines in the first place other than believe in the sacrifice of Jesus. But whatever doctrines it did hold from a cultural and church perspective, it's abandoned them. It's become a mirror to society rather than actually being a guardian over society.
Very different to Jesus' original message.
Yeah.
which is follow the commandments.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think that the only religion that's going to be left standing is going to be Islam, and this is exactly what Andrew Tate said as well, and we covered in another video, which is that he chose Islam. He said because there isn't another religion to choose. There is no other religion to offer on offer.
So the showdown will be kind of Western atheism versus Islam.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when the threat of communism disappeared temporarily between 1989 and, you know, Russia's actions in Ukraine, what's happened? You know, Islam was the big bad guy. You know, Western civilization was like, oh, Islam is the big bad guy. And at the moment Russia...
Now it's going to be Russians at airport.
Right now, you know, you notice, do we hear about Islam anymore and Islam being the big bad guy? It's completely disappeared from the airwaves because we got a new villain on the scene, right? Who we can pick on and who we can say this guy is the evil one, right? We need to focus on Russia now. So the media can only handle one villain at a time, basically.
But culturally, it feels like Islam is still seen as and understood as the real alternative, and this is what the Tate crowd are kind of
cottoning onto,
and the Jordan Petersons are kind of trying to fight against. And resurrect Christianity.
Yes.
Well, one thing that Andrew Tate said that convinced him about Islam was he said that if you look at any Muslim and you offered him like £1 million to denounce his prophet, you know, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Muslim would not do that. Even for however much money you offered, he would not denounce his prophet for the sake of worldly wealth.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true. And I think it kind of signifies that
even in ones who aren't observant.
Yeah.
Even in the ones who are not really observant.
They won't even eat pork.
Yeah. And there's no other philosophy in the world that actually can become dominant over materialism, because there's no other philosophy that people believe in as strongly as the current kind of world we live in, and liberalism, you know, everything that we have currently.
Yeah.
And Islam is the only one. So by definition, I think it's the only one that can challenge the current power.
What then about Ahmadiyya Islam versus non-Ahmadiyya Islam? How do you kind of see those two?
Well, non-Ahmadiyya Islam has no answers as well, you know, to a large extent. You look at, for example...
Or has a million different answers.
I don't think it has really an answer because they've gone away from the Quran. So the Quran is the seat of Islam. It's the throne of God. Okay, that's what the Quran is in this world. It is the throne of God. And if you, at the end of the day, you relieve that and you prefer the words and the sayings of this scholar that you followed in the 13th century, this particular Maulvi or Muallim in 14th century, at the end of the day, they might have been holy and pious. It's not the word of God. And the great sign and the great indication that the Muslims have abandoned the word of God is what Jesus said. You know, you shall know a tree by its fruits. Okay, the fruits of the Muslim world are human rights abuses, right? Sectarian warfare.
The modern Muslim world.
The modern Muslim world, not the original Muslim world. Sectarian warfare. You know, being dominated by Western powers, fighting amongst themselves, right? Natural disasters, poverty, and disease. Right? You can't, the only countries you can look to with any semblance of a question of whether they are actually developed are what? Dubai, UAE, Saudi. How do they get it? Immense oil wealth, which instead of actually bettering the condition of other Muslim neighbors, they use it instead to bomb them. Right? And they use it instead to kind of foment war with other Muslim nations as well, or they have degenerated into complete hedonism. This is the condition of UAE and Dubai and many of these nations, right? So the idea that they are paragons of Islamic virtue, they have a lot of money, so they can buy themselves out of poverty and disease, which is what you generally see in a lot of other Muslim nations. But they're still at war. They're funding proxy wars with other nations. So, you know, the reality is you know, Ahmadiyya Islam versus non-Ahmadiyya Islam. Ahmadiyya Islam is the only community with a Khalifa. It's the only community with an Imam. It's the only community that, despite trying to kill it over 120 years, continues to thrive and develop. Right? So, and we're the only community that actually reconciles the multiple theological errors that Muslims themselves have let creep into Islam by believing in Christian and Jewish doctrines and letting them and introducing them into the body of Islam. The major one being the death of Jesus, obviously. Other ones being things like taqdeer versus
continuing life of Jesus.
Continuing life of Jesus. Taqdeer versus free will is another one. The necessity of prayer and the answering of prayer. You know, so many...
Even the holy book being kind of whole and not abrogated.
I mean, this is a massive one. You know, so many non-Ahmadi Muslims, they believe, the Sunni Muslims, they believe that the Quran is abrogated. Parts of the Quran are abrogated. They can't tell you which verses.
Yeah.
Right? So
the ones they don't follow.
It's the ones they don't follow. So pretty much the whole of the holy book is therefore left in doubt, even though the beginning sentence of the book is pretty much, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. Right? Yeah. This is that perfect book which has no doubt in it. How can a book have no doubt in it if you don't even know which verses are applicable? You know, the whole book is thrown in doubt. If you have even one verse, the whole book might be the verse that you're worried about. That actually might be the one that's abrogated.
So you're saying then that it's kind of Ahmadiyya Islam versus the kind of Western atheism.
Yeah, and I think the Sunni Muslims are
conflict.
Yeah, and I think the Sunni Muslims have also a major aspect of Ahmadiyya Islam is that we believe that God still speaks. You know, why would you want to be part of a religion that God's not even going to talk to you? You're going to get up in the middle of the night. 5 times a day. Some of the times you're in the UK, Fajr is like 3:30 in the morning.
And it changes drastically throughout the day.
And it goes from like 8 a.m. all the way back to 3:30 a.m. and Ramadan.
And there are random time jumps.
Ramadan in the summer is like, you know, you're getting up at like 3:30, 3:45 to do your iftar, to do your sahri, to eat in the morning. Yeah, you do all of this and God doesn't even communicate with you.
And you have no personal certainty.
And you have no personal certainty over whether he exists or not anyway, as a result. And so you're left with this kind of wishy-washy, semi-Christian belief, which is that, oh, well, it's all faith, isn't it, really?
And interestingly, you know...
Who wants that? That's not religious belief.
Yeah.
That's religious doubt. You know, it's the glorification of doubt, which has happened in the Christian church. You know, and I fear that it would come into the Muslims. That you have these Christian bishops who say, "Oh, I'm not even sure that God actually really exists."
Well, Mother Teresa famously wrote to the Pope and said, I can't remember the phrase, but it's the silence of God.
Yeah,
you know, she suffers with the silence of God, and as our Father likes to delight in the answer back from the Pope was, "I have the same thing." Hey, me too. And yeah, you're right. That is something which theologically the non-Ahmadi Muslims, most of them / all of them, kind of deny this ongoing revelation in a real sense, even though individual Sunni Shia Muslims will kind of believe in true dreams and they'll believe that this kind of goes on.
Yeah, but true dreams are like the lowest rung,
exactly,
you know, at the end of the day. And if there isn't the possibility for an unequivocal form of revelation, true dreams, because you can have a true dream and you're was that my own thinking or was that not my own thinking? Yeah. But, you know, if there is a possibility to ascend to a stage whereby God actually communicates with you in a certain way, then that, in actual fact, at least is something for you to strive for. But what is there to strive for if you're going to be left in doubt for the whole of your life? And Islam is not a religion which, you know, it has many teachings which do require self-discipline. And at the end of the day, if you're going to give up all of those things, you're not going to date, right? It's a major thing for young Muslim men. They do date. They just hide it from their parents, a lot of them, right? So if you're going to go through all of these hoops and jumps, and then in the end of it, you're not even going to get certainty that you've done the right thing.
Yeah.
And it's like an indictment of Islam that in the past, God would talk to prophets and ordinary people.
Yeah, all these 13th century saints that they keep talking about and citing, they'll have had these experiences.
Exactly. And yet now God would be silent.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Quran, for example, you know, I often point this out that people really underrate this woman. Okay, I mean, there's one woman in the Quran that if Muslims really reflected upon this lady's behavior, they would be shocked. Right, it's the mother of Moses. Right, the mother of Moses was told by God, "Put your newborn child in a basket on a river and let it go." This is an ordinary woman, pre-Islam, pre-Mosaic law. This is an ordinary woman who is a follower of you could say the Abrahamic faith. Okay, belief in one God, do good deeds, probably some simple laws. Right. And she had developed such certainty with that kind of more primitive religious belief in God that she was willing to do that on effectively on the basis of her faith. Now, how many Muslim women are there today who, if they thought that God had told them to put a daughter in a river or a son in a river, would go ahead and do that?
They wouldn't believe that God could tell them that.
They couldn't believe that God could tell them that in the first place.
They'll come to one of us, psychiatrists.
So my point is that, you know, if they just reflected on that one example, that one woman from the people of Moses, from the Israelites, she has greater faith than pretty much all of the Muslim scholars of today, the non-Ahmadi Muslim scholars, because none of them can say that God has spoken to them. None of them even claim it.
Okay, well, I hope that answers the question. I think that's all the questions that we have had.
We didn't really answer it because, you know, how do we create such society? The simple answer is that God does.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that could have been just said right at the beginning, couldn't it?
That's what I was driving at, actually.
But I guess, you know, individuals and the need for religion among individuals then create that societal changes.
Yeah, and in a sense, it's liberating. And this goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about changing the world. Is you do your best, but you liberate yourself from the burden of actually changing the world. You put your effort in with the knowledge that your effort will only bear fruit through God's grace.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately going to be up to God when the world changes and in what direction. You just do the best with what's available to you with sincere intention and hard work. But you're not the one in charge fundamentally. So it will be God who creates it, and we obviously believe that God founded the Ahmadiyya Muslim community by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of this community, as the Noah's Ark for this age, to reform the people.
So just going back, do we rate ChatGPT answer?
No.
And is this the secret to happiness?
Yes.
What were we talking about?
Rational Religion live stream.
Oh yeah. Right, okay, that makes perfect sense now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for watching, and we're going to be trying to do this pretty regularly, possibly even as much as every other week, God willing. So stay tuned.
Every other Friday, yeah.
Every other Friday. So stay tuned, subscribe to our channel, like it, and follow us on our socials. And thank you very much from me.